work in the world, because the conversation that has happening and is happening in the world about women and women as artists, the power of women in art, is somewhat based in this exhibition that occurred in 2016, and I hope you all enjoy this film.
This is a promise with a catch. Only if you're looking will it find you. 'Cause true love is searching too. But how could it recognize you unless you step out into the light, the light, the light? Don't be sad, I know.
It was about this group, this wonderful, creative, mad group.
They had a job to do, and that job was to get married, to have children, to keep a house, and they basically said, I'm not doing that.
They already started to have differences about his expectations and hers.
She was a traditional woman. She went wildly off course, according to 1950s America.
It was immediately influential on other artists of the time, some of whom were unwilling to credit a woman fully with the amazing technical innovation.
And the painting that was on her easel is a bloated figure with a head wound and an evil eye up in the corner.
They were literally fighting to find themselves.
I wanted to see who'd been left out of the canon, who was not known in abstract expressionism. And as it turned out, there were all these women.
In 1951, an exhibition called the 9th Street Show was presented in downtown New York. It was one of the first to present the achievements of artists who were associated with this movement called abstract expressionism. It included quite a few artists. 9 women took part in the exhibition.
Great painting, great art in general, is not about materials used or methods mastered or even talent possessed. It is a combination of all these factors and an individual driven by a force that seems outside of them toward an expression of an idea they often do not understand. 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel.
The art history that was being written in the mid-20th century was pretty much a history written by white men. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, they were writing about white men. The lack of attention to the art that these women were making, either during their lives or thereafter, did not go on the written record in the same way as the art critics and historians, mainly men, who really were building what came to be thought of as the canon.
I think in any situation like that, you have to work twice as hard, 10 times as hard to get the same recognition that a man would normally get without any effort at all.
I think every woman has had the experience of having possibilities foreclosed, opportunities that the men received but they didn't, or doing the same work that men did and not being recognized or rewarded for the same work.
All of those women faced the same problems as they still do, but to a much more severe extent, because at that time, no one thought that was a problem, except the 52% of the world's population known as females, and they put up with it.
So in 1990, I was working at an art magazine in DC, and the editor asked me to go interview Grace because she was having kind of a resurgence. She had a few shows in New York. A monograph had just been written, and she had just turned 64. And we had a scheduled 1-hour interview that lasted for 4 hours, and she told me a story about her work and her time that was so much more interesting than anything I had ever read in the art history courses I'd taken or anything I had ever known. And it was about this group, this wonderful, creative, mad group that worked together and supported each other outside of society at a time when not only were they unrecognized by art scholars and art critics in America, but they were unknown around the world, and that women were part of this ferment. I thought, how tragic then that the women who were part of this not only have individually been removed, but as a group they've been removed as the stories come down to us through history.
There is this place for creativity or the expression of our creativity that is fundamental. You know, it's as much part of life as eating and sleeping.
There's a moment where New York becomes the big center of cultural life, of painting, of poetry, of lyrics, of music. And with that is a moment that's ripe, that's due for a truly genuine American movement that was the abstract expressionists.
Without knowing the sort of social setting and the historical context within which they worked, you can't possibly understand that the reason they began painting seemingly nothing but marks on the canvas was because they had to start from scratch. They couldn't borrow any of the language from the past. They had to create their own language, and that's what they did, and that's what abstract expressionism is.
And it's this moment after World War II when Europe, which had been until then commonly assumed as the kind of heart of avant-garde culture, Paris particularly, World War II had devastated Europe.
I think it's hard for us to reconstruct and imagine what it was like to live through World War II. The extent and the depth of the degradation and violence that humans were capable of waging on each other was really, truly devastating for the artists. For them, it was a loss of faith in other human beings and a loss of faith in politics as a solution.
What a difficult time to create, you know, at a time of so much darkness, and yet because they were artists, because that's what they were profoundly to their core, they had no choice but to do that. They went into themselves as deeply as they could to find their essence, to express it on canvas. They were literally fighting to find themselves. It's the kind of thing that most people go to a therapist to do.
This attitude to look inside oneself rather than to look outside for subject matter, for inspiration, became a very important aspect of how artists would create their subject matter.
One by one, they started to develop their new, although certainly influenced by many precedents, their new development in American painting that would eventually make them superstars.
During the course of the abstract expressionist movement, there were at any given time maybe 12, maybe up to 30 women who were really working in the scene. But I had to do what I wanted to do. I had to narrow it down. But I chose these 5 because they represent a 20-year difference in age. And they also were fundamental to the movement itself. These women not only wanted to work outside the home, they didn't want to have a home. They didn't want to have children. None of them could actually, during their formative years of being an artist, see how they could fit that dual role of being a mother and an artist and be true to themselves. Grace Hardigan, who went from being a New Jersey housewife and mother to being a cutting-edge artist in Manhattan in the space of about 4 years. Hers is really the most essentially archetypally female story. She was a traditional woman. She went wildly off course, according to 1950s America. She gave up her only son because she knew she couldn't be a mother and a painter. She lived on the Lower East Side in a studio without heat or electricity. She had affairs with men, not because she loved them, but because she just liked sex. This was at a time when women never did that, or if they did it, they certainly didn't talk about it. Then the love of her life was a gay poet, Frank O'Hara. Her story was kind of the most tragic because she rose to the very top in the 50s. She was the heralded artist. She had sellout shows repeatedly, and she fell off the map in the 60s. She still showed, but she wasn't Grace Hardigan, the star. And that's because she fell in love and moved to Baltimore, which didn't exist in the art world.
Grace was always curatorially and commercially successful, particularly in the 50s. We look back and we say, you know, oh, it was so great she was included in these shows, but I mean, again, it was like the token woman alongside all of her other male counterparts. And those works were selling. I mean, she was selling things when she was making them, but they were at a fraction of the price as, you know, her peers within that community. It's still the case that women artists are substantially undervalued compared to their male counterparts.
She said, well, I really want to be judged by my work. They said, okay, we could have you have a show, but we have to call you George Hardigan so that if any critics come, they won't dismiss you before they even see your work. And one of the big-time art critics came and was enthralled, as everyone else was, by this new guy on the block, George Hardigan. Grace smoking her pipe, being her wonderful, charming self. Finally, she said to the critic, by the way, those are my paintings. My name is Grace, as you know. There is no George Hardigan. Perhaps it was possible for women to not only mop the floors and take care of the messed up men's lives and the messed up world that they created, but also paint up a storm. And she helped to open up that door.
Grace was an artist who was grappling with figuration both at the beginning and at the end of her life.
Figuration was almost a sin in New York in the 1950s, and a lot of artists paid dearly for it, for dabbling in it, or at least women artists did. Strangely, Grace Hardigan and Elaine de Kooning were ridiculed and discouraged from working in those quasi-figurative styles.
By being both a portraitist and an action painter, she had tools to segue into deconstructing the figure and becoming either figurative abstraction or pure abstraction in a way that very few other artists of that period could.
One of the main mouthpieces for the abstract expressionist movement was the magazine Art New, still in publication today, run by Thomas Hess, who was an important early champion. He hired Elaine de Kooning as one of his frontline critics who wrote some of the most important things about artists and their working processes that we still use today.
Elaine became the voice of the movement. She was a translator for her own work and for her fellow artists at a time when people were looking at this stuff, when they just began looking at this stuff and had no idea what it was. Elaine put it in everyday language, and through her writing in Art News, she basically invited readers to go with her to meet her friends.
I think the word domestic is a word that almost all of these women hated, and this generation certainly rejected the idea of domesticity and saw it as a trap. You know, Elaine de Kooning famously thought that she and Willem could both use a wife because she wasn't going to cook him dinner and clean the house.
Shortly after they were married, they already started to have differences about his expectations and hers. His were Susie Homemaker, and hers were staying the course to become a great artist. Her search for creating and painting was never more fueled by his teachings, which allowed her to have breakthroughs in her creativity and in her style.
Bill was a teacher and a mentor for Elaine, but Elaine reached out for a place that Bill didn't even know existed, a Mount Olympus. She saw what he was doing, the fact that she could easily imagine that. It was big. I speak your language. I show you what you're all about. None of the other women could bring that intellectual caliber that Elaine never stopped delivering. Clay Freed in 9th Street Women.
Elaine never divorced Willem, even after he had told her early on in their marriage that he didn't want to have children. He went ahead and had a child, an illegitimate child. Elaine rose above that. She stayed focused on her mission. She was in love with Bill. She was always in love with Bill. He was recovering from alcoholism, but had Alzheimer's. He invited her to come back. Elaine lovingly went back and helped him restart his painting and helped him with his final series.
In the portraits that she would do of all of her friends, especially friends and colleagues who were also artists, she painted Robert De Niro Sr., who was also a painter, and that is, of course, the actor's father. And he was so fidgety during the sit that she had placed a television. She had him sitting, looking over his shoulder and watching TV so that he would sit still.
She has this phenomenal opportunity. She's invited by the White House to paint President Kennedy's portrait.
She's the only female artist that has been able to paint the portrait of a sitting president. And so she traveled with him for a little over a year, up until his assassination.
That portrait would become the foundation of a major exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery.
She was a master portrait artist. She really had the ability to capture an image, a likeness of whomever it was.
If you weren't going to museums or you didn't have museums in your community that had this art, this new art on the wall, it came through magazines. I'm thinking particularly of Helen Frankenthaler's spread in Life magazine. Here was this beautiful woman who, you know, for all intents and purposes for most of America should have been a housewife, but she looked, you know, gorgeous, and there she was making these paintings.
Helen was one of the most fascinating characters because she lived her life on the edge. She had no sense of any limitations, personal, social, artistic. No didn't exist in her vocabulary. She entered the scene and jumped right into the middle of it. She had just graduated from Bennington College and she became the girlfriend of Clem Greenberg, the most important critic on the scene. She was once asked if she thought she made it as a painter because she was Clem's girl. And she said, no, I'm Helen's girl. And that's how she lived her life. She was born wealthy. She was born beautiful. She was born talented. And she was always suspected of having it too easy. Critics would ask her questions like, oh, did you notice that the color of your painting matches the color of your clothes?
Is it hard to want to be a painter?
Well, I think the first issue is being a painter.
Frankenthaler struggled overtly with sexist reviews and reactions and descriptions of her work. Frankenthaler's style courted the feminine. It was transparent, pastel, it looked like watercolor in many ways, that there was something that was decorative in a positive sense about her work. Helen Frankenthaler really developed a technical innovation, which was an enormous and original and identifiable way of working with paint, which was very, very thinned down, soaked and stained and poured onto raw canvas.
Helen arrived in the spring of 1951 for her first visit to the Pollock household. Whatever its genesis, by the end of her stay, Helen would be transformed as an artist. There was something fascinating about seeing his actual studio, the stillness in which such chaos was produced, the cans of paint, rags, cigarette butts, and sand scattered around the room, the smell of solvents and oil, which to a painter are as evocative as the scents in a chocolatier shop are for a child. With streams of sunlight filtering through its cracked wooden siding, that humble barn was the scene of a revolution. Soaking it all in, Helen realized something she had not understood when merely viewing Jackson's work on a gallery wall. Pollock didn't paint with his hands or his wrists or even his arms. He painted with his whole body. Helen saw the potential for her own work in this method. She too wanted to engage her entire person in her paintings, not merely the delicate extremities that held a brush. She did not want to paint on canvas, she wanted to paint in it.
It was immediately influential on other artists of the time, some of whom could recognize that and some of whom were unwilling to credit a woman fully with the amazing technical innovation.
The so-called color field artists, Kenneth Nolan, Morris Louis, would not have careers without Helen Frankenthaler.
No artistic advance is ever without precedent. Even the most rebellious among New York's avant-garde acknowledged they were indebted to the artist who preceded them. But faced with an innovation that alters the direction of art, a lively, sometimes acrimonious debate can erupt over whether the person who made it was really the first to have been so bold. The debate over who dripped first lasted decades after Pollock's death. In Helen's case, the question debated among painters themselves, and then by generations of scholars, was an equally silly one. Who made the first stain? 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel.
She had a very privileged childhood, but a very abusive childhood. And she was so conflicted. And yet her paintings were absolutely luminous. Her mother was a poet, and as a young girl, Joan had to choose between becoming a painter to please her father and becoming a poet like her mother. And she chose painting to please this man she could never please. But when she became an adult, her paintings were poems, and so she merged both of those sides of her.
Joan Mitchell, unlike some of the other women artists and many, many Black artists, Latino artists, Asian American artists, unlike many of these other marginalized artists, she actually not only was recognized by her fellow artists from early on, but had a career almost from the very beginning and was showing in galleries, and her work was being acquired by museums.
Joan was critically important because she was the first woman painter to really be taken seriously from the start, from the moment she started painting, as a force to be reckoned with.
Mitchell's painting is rooted in landscape, but it reaches far beyond that. She used the phrase, the feeling of a landscape, to describe what she was after. Like many painters educated in the early decades of the 20th century, part of one's education in a way was you were expected to go to France if you were thinking about modern art, modern painting. And she had this foot on both sides of the Atlantic for about 4 years until she finally committed to living in France full time. There are letters that she wrote to friends where she says, it's an easier life as a painter, a more dignified life as a painter here than it is in New York. And I think it was also kind of less heated competition in a way. She could focus. She could follow her own ideas without worrying so much about what everyone else was going to think or what the critics were going to say. It gave her freedom.
And what she produced was a miracle on canvas.
One of my most favorite paintings, which is currently in the Jewish Museum, is Lee Krasner's self-portrait of her painting herself, her looking directly at the viewer, but her canvas is, you can see it on the right side of the composition. You don't know exactly what she's painting, but it's such an arresting portrait.
Lee was a foundational force well before Pollock ever came on the scene, as a leader, as an artist, as one of the best eyes in the country for painting. As an organizer in the 30s, when artists were political activists as well, Lee was actually a leader of those demonstrations.
She quite knowingly and willingly sacrificed her career in order to further her husband's health and his career as well. She was a very outspoken advocate for Pollock's work throughout his entire life, and especially early on.
There was a moment when Lee took Pollock, this raw Pollock, and started molding him and guiding him in a way. And his friends noticed the change in him, and they said they were shocked that he listened to Lee the way he did, that he let her into his studio, talk to him about his paintings in a way that no one else had.
I think the most important aspect of her relationship with Pollock was her strong belief in him, that she had a certain instinct about his genius, and that she was the person who was going to be able to encourage and cultivate it. That her role as his wife was really as a colleague almost, more than just as a lover and a caretaker.
They were married for 11 years, and during that time, Lee held his hand basically through extremely difficult moments due to his drinking and self-destructive tendencies, and just his paranoia and his mania. He was a very disturbed individual. Lee held on. She said it was like holding a comet by the tail. She held on to try to preserve this artist, Jackson Pollock, not as she would because she was a 1950s wife and that was her role, to take care of the man while he worked. It's because she thought her job was to protect this artist, Jackson Pollock, who she thought was the most important artist the United States had ever produced.
But that doesn't in any way minimize the importance of her own work, especially in the late 1940s. Those so-called little image paintings are as important as anything any American artist made in the late 1940s. But somehow she, probably based on her biography of being devoted to her husband, has been left out of a lot of those early histories. That is really a disgrace in terms of the importance of that first generation figure.
By 1956, their marriage was crumbling, and Lee couldn't handle it anymore. And she went to Europe, where she spent some time with Helen and hung around with some of her old friends from the early days in New York. She was gone for only 1 month. Pollock didn't even last the month. By the end of it, he was dead.
One of the most disturbing paintings she ever did is now known as Prophecy. It's the painting that was on her easel in the upstairs bedroom studio when Pollock was killed. She and he had planned to go to Europe, but Jackson began to have an affair with a much younger woman, and Lee decided to take the trip on her own. And after she left, Jackson moved the girlfriend into the house to live with him. And the painting that was on her easel is a bloated figure with a head wound and an evil eye up in the corner. She came back from Europe and had to face this painting of what many people have interpreted as the foreshadowing of Pollock's death. Because he had been drinking heavily, he was very bloated, he gained a lot of weight, and he was killed by smashing his head against a tree. So this was clearly a signal moment in her development as an artist, and also as now the widow and administrator of Pollock's estate. The year after his death, when Lee was his executor and the manager of his estate, the most that had ever been paid for one of his paintings was $8,000. The Metropolitan Museum paid $30,000 for Autumn Rhythm. It had been offered for $8,000 to the Modern, and they had turned it down. And there was a kind of shock in the art world. My God, they paid $30,000 for this thing. And it was attributed to Lee's acumen and her bargaining power, that she could have said, you need to have it, and there will be no more like this. After Jackson died, Lee moved into this barn studio. It's 21 feet square, roughly, and much larger than the upstairs room that she was working in. So she was able to really spread out. What I find fascinating about the aftermath of Pollock's death is that there was a kind of freedom now. As grieving as she was, as devastated as she was by Pollock's death, she was liberated in a sense. And I think that's what came out. Then her mother died, and that's when the grief poured out into her canvases. The Eye is the First Circle is one of the largest paintings she ever painted, and it shows the exuberant gestures that she was able to create. And there's a kind of darkness to the emotional undertones of the work as well. But it was an expression of the grief at her mother's death, and then I think the residual grief at Jackson's death. For me, that is the definition of abstract expressionism.
By the late 60s, a critic by the name of Irving Sandler was already at work on what would become the major volume, The Triumph of American Painting. And what you start to notice is the women artists are entirely absent. How does that work for a woman artist or a gender non-conforming artist or someone who doesn't match that, again, rather strict and rather narrow definition of what abstract expressionism was? The idea that an act of putting paint down on canvas, it was a heroic act in many respects, believing that painting itself was a heroic practice.
In about the mid-50s, a discussion began among critics. One school was the Clement Greenberg School. He became the kind of the voice of this theoretical tract that removed people and history and everything but the marks on a canvas from the conversation. The other school was the Harold Rosenberg School. He said in 1958, unless people know and unless they're made aware of where these paintings arose from historically and who these artists were who made it, it's not going to have any meaning for them. And so Clem School won. Until now, we're starting to reevaluate what history means for art, the world in which artists work, and how that impacts them.
I was in New York and I happened upon an exhibition at the Jewish Museum called Action Abstraction. And it was a fantastic show. It was centered around the critics, Rosenberg and Greenberg. But there was one section where I saw a bunch of artists I'd never heard of. Mostly they were either women or men of color. So on the plane ride home, I kept thinking about this show and realizing how many women that were in this exhibition that I didn't know. Of course, we always know the 4 or 5 that are well known. So on the plane ride home, I kept thinking about putting on an exhibition of women of abstract expressionism, and of course I kept thinking someone must have done this. But as it turned out, no one had done it, so that was the impetus for this exhibition.
Sometimes the stars just align. And having the Women of Abstract Expressionism show at the Denver Art Museum, followed so closely by Mary Gabriel's wonderful book, just brought the female artists into focus in a way that they had not been before.
For me, in a way, the Denver show was the Women's 9th Street show. I think of it as the big bang for women abstract expressionists and also actually just for women artists to kind of reorient the art world and the greater society to the idea that there were women working, that their work was significant and that they were significant.
I researched with my team over 50 artists to figure out who really belonged in the show, and then of course who should wind up in the catalog. It was very difficult to bring this exhibition down to 12 artists.
The fun part of this show was to show artists that are more well-known, like Joan Mitchell or Helen Frankenthaler, and at the same time to explore some artists and to put them into the role that they deserve in the mid-century, second half of the 20th century. It's a shame that they were overlooked so far, and that it's really long due to get to know them.
People talk about the New York School. I try not to use that term because in fact there was a whole group of artists also working on the West Coast during the 1950s. And these, of course, are the Bay Area artists that are included in our exhibition.
I would say that as far as the San Francisco artists, they were very few of them are described in the major literature. So they've been left out of the literature. And that includes Deborah Remington and Sonia Getchtoff. Jay DeFeo has become a sort of national icon now. The artists in San Francisco did have advantages, the advantages of obscurity, the lack of an art market. One thing that they also had was they had tremendous institutional support, and that was different from the situation in New York.
In addition to the California School of Fine Arts, this museum, which was known as the San Francisco Museum of Art at the time, was led by a powerhouse woman named Grace McCann Morley. She provided both kind of an educational base for the museum visitors in the Bay Area, but also a really strong sense of support and connections for the artists who were working here in the Bay Area.
There's an absolutely marvelous picture of Deborah Remington, and she's facing off against a row of men, the other co-founders of the Six. I don't think you would ever see that photograph come out of the New York School. You know, she's obviously in charge. She's a strong, very strong personality, and in fact, supposedly she coined the name of the gallery and even conceived of it.
I'm happy that this exhibition got so much recognition. And in my mind, someday the women and the men will be shown equally, side by side, without any distinction.
It was undeniable. Here was this group of women who had been written out of the abstract expressionist story largely because it became the story of men. And yet here they were. Their work was magnificent, it was bold, it was large, and they were a force to be reckoned with. And so that was the first time I think art audiences really got a look of them.
Denver Art Museum was a really important exhibition because it was the first time where, it wasn't just, okay, here's a female painter next to the, her male counterpart. It was a show that was just dedicated and focused on this group of women. And I only wish it had traveled to every city in the United States and the world.
Since the Denver show, there have been a series of exhibitions and really important kind of recalibrating of these women's stories.
We are here in our exhibition space in Southampton in front of a mini retrospective of paintings by Grace Hartigan. So part of the reason why we're doing this exhibition is to remind people about how important Grace Hartigan was to American art.
At the Museum of Modern Art today, we're actually very fortunate to have a collection that was built mainly at the time of works by most of these women that are pretty outstanding with a 21st century attitude that has shed many of the old prejudices about who and what are more or less important. And so we had the opportunity to put on view works by figures such as Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Lee Krasner, that were waiting in our storage to get their moment in the light again. And many more women whose names aren't even as well known.
The Met has made huge strides in altering what it offers to visitors, changing the way that curators interpret works of art on the wall, and moving towards a much greater diversification in what we collect, what we show. Alice Neel exhibition was astonishingly popular. It was popular through word of mouth. And I think that the fact that, you know, a woman artist who had been pretty much neglected for most of her life had become this kind of crucible of relevance at a time when everyone needed this.
We have a small but mighty collection of Mitchell paintings here at SF MoMA. And one of our aspirations for the Joan Mitchell exhibition was not just to kind of fit her into an existing story, but to give a full and nuanced, complex account of her work, what she did, how she fit in and moved in the social circles, both in New York and in Paris, and in so doing to really expand how we think about painting entirely, that it's not the narrative we've been told.
I think something else that's really, really exciting is that people are beginning to expand beyond this little group of New York painters in the 50s, and to bring in people like Alma Thomas, who was working in Washington, D.C., and shares a lot of interest with Joan Mitchell. She's, you know, another master of color, another master of oil paint, another person who connects empathetically and sensitively to nature. But because she wasn't part of the social milieu of downtown New York, I think her work has not been considered both on its own merits and in relationship to other kinds of abstract painting. It's important that we reconstruct the diversity of downtown New York in the 50s and add the women, add the artists of color, and see the other artists who are working in a related way, including around the world.
With this new way of dealing with art history, I noticed that there were so much women artists that were not visible in this history, and that they were bringing something specific, sort of expanded version of abstraction that goes beyond painting, but includes the relationship to the body through dance. So I tried to rewrite the history of abstraction and to show how much women were co-creators of this history.
At $9.5 million, at $10 million. $9 million now, against all of you here. 550,000. Barrett coming in.
Suddenly, the women artists who were so much a part of this scene, so crucial, so instrumental to the landscape of American art, starting to achieve higher prices. People started to pay attention, and people started to question if Pollock can be worth $100 million. Why is Lee Krasner worth not even $1 million? None of this made any sense, and the market started to pay attention.
It is for you, Max. 10 million, 500,000. Sold 550.
By positioning female artists within our biggest sales to our top collectors, both at auction and privately, we're telling the market, this is a genre that you have to pay attention to. This is an artist that matters and is important and is going to be in the books forever.
408, 500, sold, 6 million.
For the past decade, as I've been telling people to pay attention to the work of female artists, to buy Lee Krasner and Frankenthaler and Grace Hardigan and Joan Mitchell, it's funny to now see them 10 years later kicking themselves as those prices have really skyrocketed, and also as the scarcity of real quality works continues to diminish. I mean, what's going to happen is the best examples are going to be picked up by collectors, they're going to be put into museums, and they're not going to be available anymore. We're already seeing it start to happen. So I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so.
Sold 550.
You have to have time to feel sorry for yourself if you're going to be a good abstract expressionist. And I think I always considered that a waste.
Like all movements, there's always a sort of young artist nipping at your heels. And certainly by the mid-50s, people like Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg in New York and elsewhere, were starting to find abstract expressionism to be something of a cliche. The idea that so much was put into the importance of a single mark. So it was these younger artists who started to chip away at that and, of course, invented their own new way of thinking. And so the movement's glory years were probably roughly 1945 to about 1960, even though many artists' career, Joan Mitchell, Clifford Still, Willem de Kooning, extends into the 1990s and beyond.
I think we're living through a great moment of historical reconsideration. Again, not just for women, but for African American, Asian American, Latino artists. There's so much work to be done, so many histories that haven't been recognized.
The history of art as it is being told right now, and looking backwards too, in our reassessment of how art history has been created, it is a much broader, much more exciting, much more nuanced collection of stories that can actually reveal to us not just the great breadth and scope of what humanity is able to do, but also from which we truly learn.
We're all startlingly the same, and that's a terrific thing. And the independent, individual, human way of thinking and feeling and being was something that a lot of these great women that this book was written about were doing at a time when I was considered to be almost sacrilegious and antisocial, not to be at check, but to be more than that. And the terrific thing about them was that they were doing that for no reason other than somehow all of them felt worthy and they knew their value.
As I was writing my book, I really came to the conclusion that art functions in society the way religion does, that both are necessary to nourish sort of the collective soul, and that both exist, both require an individual to go deep inside of themselves to find answers to profound questions, and also to look well beyond themselves for answers. We do it today in this kind of mad, fast-paced world where nothing makes sense, there is no truth. You know, where do you look for answers? You have to go where they went, where religion goes, which is deep inside and well beyond us.
Okay, maybe while this goes on, I can invite our panelists, Gwen, Simon, David, and Beverly, if you don't mind coming and sitting. Yeah. Well, can I invite another applause for this wonderful documentary? Truly wonderful. And if this continues, is that okay if you, can you sit? And I don't want to block any because these are, credits are important. Okay, so what a fascinating topic, a little trip down memory lane, Gwen. Seems ages ago, but it really is just 2016. And so nice to actually see the exhibition recognized and the work of Gwen recognized for an exhibition that was truly groundbreaking. And nice to know that people has to come to Denver to see groundbreaking exhibition like this. So we would like to have about 20 minutes of Q&A to give everybody the opportunity to ask your questions to our panelists, the filmmakers, editor, and curator of the exhibition. And Zoe and I, Zoe is our wonderful coordinator, we'll come to you, so just raise your hand and we'll give you the mic. Maybe I just thought of starting just a quick question for Beverly and David. I was wondering, is anything that surprised you during the making of the documentary, something that you did not expect as you entered this project?
I don't know that we were surprised, but we were just overwhelmed with all the stories that kept appearing and all the stories that kept appearing as we went around the country. Well, we didn't go all around the country, but the limited journeys that we made. We were at the Pollock Krasner house, and somebody came up and said that his aunt used to hang out with Jackson Pollock, and he started to tell us these stories about how he had traded his paintings at the general store for groceries. And, you know, like 5 minutes later, somebody else would come and start telling a similar story. So we just realized there's all these stories out there that you could spend a lot of time just following these threads and how interesting they are. And it's something I would love to do, actually. But I think we were just amazed at the wealth of material that's still out there, and people are willing and eager to tell these stories. And it's a lot of the people are getting on in age, and they're going to disappear. But just these firsthand stories.
So to follow up what David just said, David has a really good friend, Dan Weldon, who's in the film very briefly, and he was such a good friend of Elaine de Kooning. Oh my gosh, we had no idea. David did a film with him many years ago, and with Dan, and on his process. And so we were just staying with Dan at his house in Sag Harbor in order to do some filming out in the Hamptons. And it wound up that Dan and Elaine were really good friends. And this goes along with what David was just saying. And we wound up interviewing Dan because Elaine de Kooning wound up printing in the later part of her life some of her works. And she printed with Dan. And they were friends for at least 20 years. And not only was she friends with Dan, but she was also very close friends with the husband of the woman who runs the Pollock Krasner House. So there were all these little threads that kept unraveling. But I just want to say one other thing. Mary talks about at the end, and so does David Amram, who's the composer who knew many of these women, about going deep inside and how we can find meaning by going deep inside. And that was something significant that I also discovered from many of the people we talked to, that they found how important it was for them to find meaning and to find value in their lives. And in this world that seems to find very little value in people's personal lives, that seemed to be of real importance for people. And so those were kind of a couple of the things that I found. And integrity, value and integrity. So that's what I found.
Thank you. All right, question?
I'd like to say that absolutely beautifully done. I had read the book years ago and I just loved it, and I had the same visceral feeling as I'm watching this movie. But what I'm curious about is how you ever got off the ground. Like, what appealed to the two of you that said, oh my God, this has to be a documentary, and then to go to all the effort you must have had to go through to get it off the ground?
This project has a long history and it goes way back. Originally, our good friend and producer Joshua Hassel had started the project mostly based on the exhibit itself. And unfortunately, through his illness, a lot of the material had been lost, the hard drives of things, and a couple of years had passed. And so Dominic had asked me to come in and see how we could finish the project.
Well, he asked the Schlers. He asked the Schlers. Right, Simon?
How we could finish the project, and time had passed, and I was aware of the Mary Gabriel's book that had been written. I was fascinated by it, and came back to Dominic and said, wouldn't it be great if we can sort of update this and see what the ripple effect was of Gwen's exhibit and how this now new book has been impacting the world? And he said, great, go do it. And so we had to find money to do that, but also had to follow this thread of, well, how do we get a hold of Mary Gabriel? And we were in New York, and we had met with the, don't use my hands, I know. With the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, and we mentioned this, like, we'd love to get a hold of this author. And she said, well, I talk to her all the time. I think she's going to be in the States next month. And so we happened to catch her. She was in Miami for 2 days, and we were able to schedule her for 1 day. And so we interviewed her. And then it sort of snowballed from there. It's like that led the door to somebody else, led the door to somebody else. And it's almost like the program wanted to be made. And sort of, as Helen Harrison says, the stars were just aligned in reference to what she said about the exhibit and the book. But it's also sort of the way that the project came together, too.
And I'd like to say that every single person we talked to, including Mary, indicated that the exhibition here in 2016, and they gave Gwen the credit for the 2016 exhibition, that the exhibition here was the fundamental foundation for the conversation that was going globally about women in art and the women in abstract expressionism. And not only was that the case, but the book was becoming much more popular. It was at that time a New York Times bestseller. And Mary led us, right, through a number of her contacts to people who were very supportive of this project. And so it was really, and Gwen knew many of them, and they didn't want to tell, like Gwen wouldn't tell us who she knew, and they wouldn't tell us who they knew, and it turned out that they were the same exact people. And so it was really quite funny, so Gwen probably...
Thank you. I want to say one thing that I think, first of all, congratulations to both of you. This is an extraordinary film. And I want to say that it's kind of the final piece, not final in the sense that it's all over, but you know, we have the exhibition, we have the catalog that many of you know includes over 40 artists beyond the 12 that we could include. Then you have the book, and now we have the film. So I think this is a really important piece of it. Thank you.
This question is to Gwen. I was one of the beneficiaries of your amazing exhibit. I came to it probably 6 times, and we came to a time when you spoke, and it was just an amazing step.
Who's talking? Oh, now I can see you. Thank you.
So I wanted to know a little bit more about what was involved in you actually putting this exhibit together.
Well, I mentioned that 2008 exhibition that I saw at the Jewish Museum. If anybody tells you that curators travel too much, don't believe them. I was there to see something totally different in New York, but you know, when you're on that travel dime, you see as many things as you can from early to late. And I went into the Jewish Museum and I saw this show, and I was shocked, because I thought I knew a lot about abstract expressionism. And yet there were people in that show, sort of in an alcove, that I'd never heard of. And frankly, people have said to me, what's the most surprising thing about your exhibition? And what I've said is the most surprising thing to me was that nobody had done it before. There was a very small exhibition of just a very few women at a university in New York City. That was it. No major museum. And it's just wonderful for me now to see all of these experts and all of these people from major places talking about how important the women are. And, you know, we live in Denver, and we certainly sent out the query and invited so many participants. And we were delighted that we came up with an East Coast venue and a West Coast venue. But people would say, well, how come it didn't go here, it didn't go there? And, you know, all I did was smile, because, of course, you know, it wasn't that we weren't having these discussions, but it's very hard to travel a show. And when it's a show about New York artists and it's coming out of Denver, you know, it makes it that much more difficult. But I would say that, you know, we really feel that we've been celebrated. Does that answer your question? Oh.
I wanted to know a little bit more about how you actually got the art. How did that come about?
Okay, in other words, how did I build the checklist, or how did the art physically get here? Any of it. Oh boy, she needs to.
Person might be one example.
I'm not sure who you mean. Well, what I want to say is, of course, first of all, I had some wonderful graduate students. I also taught at University of Denver. I've just now become emerita in both places. Isn't that exciting? So anyway, I had some great graduate students. We made notebooks, and we, you know, did a lot of research to figure out who we could include. And the reality is, some people said, well, you can't really have an exhibition with more than 5 or 6 artists, because, you know, it won't be cohesive. And when you looked at the 5 or 6 artists that you might have, well, everybody already knew them. So to be blunt, my ideal was 15. When we looked at the gallery, there was absolutely no way to get 15 artists, and Angelica's nodding. So we settled on 12. We even had to build walls over the stairwell on the 4th floor in order to fit in the 12. And then we went about trying to find out where these works are and who owned them. So some were private, some were from institutions. You have to request these works, and of course, in order to publish a catalog, you also have to get rights and reproductions. And by the way, Yale published our catalog And it's in something like the 8th printing. I might be wrong about that because I keep getting updates, but it's wild. Nobody expected it. We ran out of catalogs before the show was over here, and it was still traveling to 2 more venues. So I hope that answers your question. We have wonderful people at the museum who take the responsibility of moving. And I want to say SF MoMA lent us that enormous J. DeFeo. It took about 12 people to install it. And usually conservators are the ones who say, well, you know, this is really too hard and it's too dangerous. And that conservator was so incredibly generous to enable that to travel to all 3 venues. So I want to give them credit for that.
And I wanted to keep the mic going because one thing I wanted you to maybe add is great exhibition like this are also great opportunity for wonderful acquisitions. And you have been, because of this exhibition, you have really been the lead on and put a lot of effort in not only have a great temporary exhibition, but also making sure that for our audiences, for the collection of the Denver Art Museum, you would add. So do you want to say a little?
Thank you. I want to say that from the very beginning, it was really important to me that the Denver Art Museum would be the place that people would have to come if they wanted to study women abstract expressionists. Now, you know, we don't have enormous acquisition funds, right, Angelica? Yep. But the first 2 things that came in, one was a gift of the Mary Abbott painting, which is just beautiful, and we just showed it at DU in a beautiful little exhibition. And it's called All Green, and it was a gift of Tom and Janice McCormick. He's a gallerist in Chicago who really became a friend all the way through this exhibition. But the other one is the enormous Elaine de Kooning bullfight that I'm sure you all know. It's like 132 inches wide. So I was in New York, and I met with a gallerist in his little tiny New York studio. And this is so early on, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was basically saying, I'm trying to figure out who should go in this show. But of course, I named a few artists, and he pulls out his cell phone, and he says to me, well, I was just in Elaine de Kooning studio in the Hamptons. And, you know, I asked her nephew, what was in these big tubes in the corner? And he pulled out 4 canvases. And they were spectacular. They were all bullfights. And, you know, they weren't even selling any of this yet. But the nephew was beginning to think about it. And, by the way, this was Mark Borghi, the gallerist, who I also want to credit because not only did he share that with me, he pulled out his cell phone. The most beautiful one is the one upstairs, maybe in the gallery, maybe in storage right now. And I had no money, and I just said, please save that one for the Denver Art Museum. And he really negotiated with the family to enable us to afford it. So I want to give him credit. You know, a lot of times gallerists get bad names, and these 2 men were extremely helpful in this process. But yes, now we have, I forget how many, but something like 25. Many of them were gifts. Some of them we were able to purchase. I think once somebody had their work in the show, the family, often they were willing to give us one. And some people who lamented that their people were not in the exhibition, some of them were in the catalog, but by and large, they said, you know what, we want to be in this collection. We know you're valuing these women. And so they actually gifted them to the Denver Art Museum, which is pretty wonderful. And I want to say all the way from the beginning of the show until literally today, I am constantly getting emails and phone calls from people whose relatives were women abstract expressionist painters. And they haven't gotten their due. They're not published many places. There's somebody right now from New Orleans, and they have done a big catalog, but there's so many out there, and what I've said from the beginning is I hope other institutions will also do exhibitions of people we don't know as well.
Thank you, Gwen. I have a quick question, sorry, for Simon. Can you tell us what was the most challenging part, editing all of this content? I mean, we can just get a glimpse of how much, obviously, a good editor will have to leave out. So what was the hardest part?
Is this on? Well, I think, looking at David, I think he knows what I'm going to say, is the images, the pictures. So we struggled a lot because with the first cut we actually had how many images, David? 450 images that we thought we were going to use, and then it turned out that we had to cut that number down to a little over 100, right?
Probably a little over 100.
Yeah, so that was a big struggle. So there was a lot of stuff that we wanted to use that unfortunately we just couldn't because of image rights, budget reasons, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of kind of reworking of imagery. So I think that was probably the most difficult, I would say.
We kind of exploded our dream on this about like, okay, look at all this great stuff. Let's put this in, let's put that. And then the reality set in as to how complicated it is, which Gwen knows, of getting rights from sometimes 3 or 4 different institutions or individuals for a particular photograph or image of a painting.
So it's the issue not only of an exhibition being limited, but also reproductions being limited. And it's true in every publication that you ever do with images. It's expensive and it's difficult.
Well, and then that's what took the most amount of time for the film, and also was the most costly for us. And that's what Simon's speaking to right now.
Yeah. And part of it too, I think, was a lot of times there were so many restrictions with the images too, which made it very difficult. Like a lot of times I wanted to zoom in or do some kind of fun detail, but there were so many specific restrictions. You could only show it wide, or you had to show it wide first. You had to cut in, you had to, so it limited my creativeness in a sense too, where I wanted to show so much more, but I just couldn't. So that became difficult. But.
And that's often true with books as well. If you want to do a book and you want to use these images, often you're not allowed to cut them, the restrictions.
Thank you. I think there's a question.
I was just going to ask, you guys have all done a marvelous job, and it's been a project of serendipity. One thing has led to another. And I was just going to ask, Gwen, of all the serendipity that's happened from this project, what has been the most amazing person or event, or what happened to you as a result of doing this that you would have never imagined? And it was because you had this idea on a plane back from New York.
Well, first of all, the fact that the Denver Art Museum let me do it. And then we had a major donor who provided enough that I could go and travel and do the research. Before, it was just an idea at that point. And it's hard to get funding for an idea, but it was somebody who believed in all of us. But I was going to say that the thing that was been the most gratifying is the incredible recognition of this exhibition from Denver, Colorado. You saw where people were saying the 10 most important exhibitions of the decade and, listed among curators who were important. Who would have thought? And kind of after all that, and after it traveled, I thought it was time to retire.
Thank you. Other question? We have 2 more minutes. Yes?
I saw the title, "The Eye is the First Circle," was the name of a piece, and also the start of an Emerson quote. At what point or when, how did you know that was the title for this?
You start, I'll finish.
Let's see. Shortly after we had filmed Mary Gabriel, I remember we were in Miami, and I was actually still reading a lot of the book. We were starting to piece together what a storyline might be, and Beverly came in from the other room and she said, "The Eye is the First Circle. This has to be the name of this." And I go, okay. I wasn't sure why. It became the working title. At one point, we decided to change the name to Brushed Aside because we thought, well, people would maybe get that first. You see it printed on a page. It's like Brushed Aside. It made sense. And then we discussed it with Simon, and Simon said, no, it's got to be Eye is the First Circle. And so the Eye is the First Circle just kept maybe haunting us and coming back to us. And probably Beverly has a better insight than I do about that.
Well, David and I are both fans, and you might know this, Steve, of Emerson. And so it really resonated with me that Lee Krasner felt so strongly about the name of that particular painting, her largest painting. And she also had an affinity for Emerson. So immediately I was drawn to that. And so it really always held a lot of significance for me that could be the title of the film. And Brushed Aside was great, and it was like a really catchy title, but it really didn't hold that inner significance that if I'm going inside to find meaning, the eye is the first circle, the horizon is the second. That really held meaning for me because it held meaning for Lee. It held significance for her. And that when and I knew, again, synchronicities. I knew when the owners of that painting said, go ahead and use it and do whatever you want with it. And they're pretty well-heeled collectors in the world, and they also have a music. They were very happy to have the painting used for the title, for whatever we wanted. I knew that it was aligned, that the stars were truly aligned.
I just wanted to say, some of you may have seen the exhibition we did at DU that just closed on post-war abstraction from Front Range Collections. It just closed, but we were looking at the title Brushed Up, and someone said, well, you can't do that. They're going to use Brushed Aside. So we used it as a subtitle because you had gone to something else.
And I think there was one, I saw.
Yeah, there's one. I think we have one more.
Thank you all so much for telling this great story. It's so important and so timely, and I'm so happy that it's here. How can we champion how can we be your advocate and make sure that everyone sees this all across the country?
Well, so far it's scheduled to be aired over PBS 12 tomorrow evening. It'll be the first PBS broadcast. And simultaneously, it will be available for streaming over PBS Passport. So it'll be available to see from anywhere online. We're going to be approaching PBS stations in the main markets to have them pick it up. If any of you have personal connections to those stations that would provide entree, we'd appreciate that. And also, what's the third?
And we'd eventually like to put it on another streaming service.
Right, but we'd also like to do screenings such as this, especially with the institutions and the museums who were involved and help us put this together. So that's sort of our dream list of what will happen next. So we're looking for those connections too. Can we take one more question from Dirk?
Yeah, the gentleman,
Yeah.
and that will.
I thoroughly enjoyed your film. What you did. If you had a half a day, which artist would you take the time with your camera, David, and spend a half a day?
Just
Thanks.
just one artist?
It's like choosing children.
Boy, I don't know. Each of them have these different, for me, visually creative, intriguing qualities that you could just explore. And I can't imagine picking one, but all of them would be a treat. And there's so many stories that opened up through doing this that it's like, wow, I'd love to do this. I'd love to do that. So I don't know. I'm sorry I don't have that answer.
Do you all live in Denver?
We do, yes.
I just, when we were at the Paula Krasner house and we were filming there, all of a sudden, both cameras, we had James's camera and we had David's camera, both cameras just went out. Just went out. And at that moment that the cameras went out, there was a huge crash right outside the house. And Helen, who we've now become very good friends with, Helen was talking about Jackson's crash just at that moment. So
there were
Car crash
there,
right out on the street.
right out in front of the house. And so there were so many stories, like to get to know more about the two of them, to get to know more about Elaine and Bill, and Elaine in particular. We learned so much, and to explore more would be a tremendous opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for our panelists, our filmmakers. And thanks to all of you for coming. We'll see you soon.